Yes? Good, so you all know this. I got a call once between the days of awe, and I was honored. This was a particularly challenging congregant, no one you know. And I had worked very hard with this person. They had an adult b'nai mitzvah, and I had bent over backwards, and what can I do, and how can I help? And oi gewalt, this was a challenging person. And so I thought, they're calling between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the hardest, busiest time for a rabbi. Surely they are calling to make amends. They finally recognize all that I have done for them. No, they were calling because they did not like my sermon. Not a little bit. They did not like my sermon. Okay, all right. So what was the sermon about? The least controversial topic in the rabbinic repertoire, Israel. Okay, so here's what happened. My family had just gone on a trip to Israel, and it had been a while since I had been, and I remembered Israel with great fondness from my student days, and I took my new husband, his first trip to Israel, and it was tough. People were a little harder, a little rougher around the edges that I had remembered, and I might have done a little bit of a critique, and she was not happy. Rabbi, we need loyalty to Israel. You may not criticize Israel. Okay, well, she and I disagree. I think we can criticize Israel. But interestingly, this year, that is not what I am here to do. So I want to begin by prefacing all of this. We can criticize Israel. I do criticize Israel. There will be times during this sermon that I will criticize Israel. But today, I'm doubling down on my commitment as a Zionist reform rabbi. And I realize this is a congregational danger zone, and so I invite you, not between now and Yom Kippur, call me. We can talk about Israel and why I have the stance I have and why you have the stance you have and why they are legitimate stances, but why I'm right. So, if you ask the anti-Zionists, the story of Israel is very simple. There were natives on a land called Palestine, and the natives whose skin was not a privileged white were called Palestinians, and they were ruled by a foreign government, the British. And when the British departed at the end of World War II, they permitted white displaced foreigners who did not belong on the land to take over native spaces, and they continued the colonial rule, ousting the natives from their homes and leaving carnage behind. The natives have been struggling until this day to reclaim their land from European occupiers. So I once described this scenario to an adult ed class, and one man said, well, that sounds pretty accurate. It sounds accurate to a mind used to hearing that story. Yes, it's a story we know about the United States, and it's a story that sounds familiar if you know the history of India and much of Africa and South America as well. But interestingly, it is not accurate when it comes to Israel. I often quote a seminary professor that there are two ways to make a bullseye. The first is you have the bullseye, you draw it, you draw back the arrow, it's very, very hard, and you get the arrow in the bullseye. An easier way, shoot the arrow first, draw the bullseye around it. If you know the narrative that will relate to people, tell that narrative, it will ring a chord with them. The anti-Zionist stance is inaccurate. One, because Jews are native to the land. It's always just a question of how many Jews at what time. Two, because Jews are not colonialist, bringing resources back to some imperial motherland. Three, because Jews are not the same as privileged European white. Not all Jews are even white. In fact, a growing number of Jews are not, and many Jews who live in the land of Israel were displaced from Arab lands to find their way to Israel. So when the British left India, they had a home to return to. And this is not to say that we need to look into the British history of India necessarily, although if you want to, it's an interesting history. There is not, however, a long British literature of a wish to return home to India, not like the Jewish literature around Israel. There is no other country in the world whose policies prod people to call for the end of a country, and that's because it's not the policies that do it, or at least not the policies alone. We can argue that the way that Israel interacts with Palestinians leaves a lot to be desired, and I agree with that. But those policies and the way that they interact with the Palestinians is not a reason to call for the end of Israel. It happens that many liberal Jews, especially young Reform Jews, find themselves on the liberal side of the political spectrum. And whether you do or not, those Jews find ourselves supporting the rights of the oppressed. I applaud that. I, for one, even since the pandemic began, I've gone to rally to speak up for Black lives. I speak up against Asian hate. I celebrate LGBTQ pride. You know this. Some of you have argued with me about this, and I welcome those arguments as well. But interestingly, not one participant outside the Jewish community in any of these groups has reached out to me about Israel or even about anti-Semitism. Each of these spaces has a different animus towards Israel. Black Lives Matter participants see their own plight in that of the Palestinians, and it's true the Palestinians have a plight. It is true. But it is not true that the Palestinian struggle is the same as that of African Americans. As Moti Friedman points out in The Atlantic, the story of the Jewish minority in Europe and in the Islamic world, which is the story of Israel, has nothing to do with race in America. He writes, "My grandmother's parents and siblings were shot outside their village in Poland by people the same color as them. If you stand on a street in the modern state of Israel and look at passersby, you often can't tell who's Jewish and who's Arab. Many Israelis are from Arab countries, and for the 6 million Jews living in the heart of the Arab world, 300 million people, and in the broader Islamic world, 1.5 billion people, the question of who's the minority is obviously a tricky one. Most Black people in Israel are Jews with roots in Ethiopia, and the occupation of the West Bank, these are his words, is supported by many Israelis mainly because they have rational fears of rockets and suicide bombings, tactics that weren't quite the ones endorsed by the American civil rights movement. All of this is to say that although Israel, like America, is deeply messed up, it's messed up in completely different ways. In his analysis, Friedman says, but something about Palestine struck Americans as relevant to their own experience. He continues, that sentiment has moved into elite opinion. In 2019, the New York Times published an op-ed by respected scholar Michelle Alexander, the author of an important book on incarceration that described Israel's conflict with the Palestinians as one of great moral challenges of our time, the scene of practices reminiscent of apartheid in South Africa and Jim Crow segregation in the United States. The essay didn't explain why this conflict constitutes one of the great moral challenges or offer any indication that the author had ever visited Israel. Last year, the Times ran an essay by author Viet Thanh Nguyen, a Pulitzer Prize winner and a college professor in Los Angeles, that ridiculed white writers for their white privilege, identified the American dream as settler colonialism, and then segued into an attack on Israelis as settler colonialists. For these Americans, distant Jews have become an embodiment of the American evil, racial oppression. The truth is that Israel is a small country in the Middle East that has nothing to do with the demons stalking America. We have our own demons. Conflating them won't make either country's problems easier to understand or solve. I needed that article personally. When the war started in Israel this year, I was very conflicted, and I wrote to my big brother and I said, here are all the thoughts that I have. And he said, that's a lot of thoughts. Maybe we should take them one at a time. And his first question is, what does Black Lives Matter have to do with the Israel-Palestinian conflict? And that helped, and I found this article and it made sense to me. And then I heard the voices of John Oliver and Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah in particular upset me. He compared the war between Israel and the Palestinians as a fight between him and his little brother when he was young, but his little brother was but 4 years old. And I thought, you're infantilizing the Palestinians. Did your little brother throw rockets at you and then complain that you fought back? And then he said that Israel was using undue force because the death toll was unequal. And over again, this was a message that we heard, that in order for this war to be equal, more Israelis, more Jews needed to die. Because we have decent defense, we're wrong. And so I went to listen to the voices of the Israelis also. And I went to the Hartman Institute, which I find to be brilliant on these issues. And Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Hartman were in dialogue. And Yossi Klein Halevi said, I feel shattered by what Jews in America are thinking about Israel. And Hartman replies, so I hear your feeling of shattered. I just, in a certain sense, I know this is crazy, but I feel energized. My most significant commandment in my life is don't walk away from your people. Halevi says, what I need from my American Jewish partners are two things. First of all, an understanding of what I'm up against in the Middle East, what it means to be Jewish, a Jewish state in the Middle East. That's the first thing I need. I need acknowledgement that the Palestinian national movement has never accepted my legitimacy here to this day in all of its factions. That's the first thing I did when I hear that from American Jews. The next thing that I need, don't buy into the current progressive discourse that paints Israel as the unequivocal aggressor. It's more complicated, and I need to hear that from Americans. Okay. So our liberal friends who are so enlightened, so caring, so educated are headed down a path that demonizes Israeli Jews, our friends, our family, afar, and often goes beyond the boundary of anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. And I could tell you all about definitions and where that line blurs. I don't believe that they're always the same thing, but they certainly are sometimes the same thing. So what do we do? Well, it may sound familiar, but the answer is to connect. To connect with those we align to politically, that they hear our story, the story of our families, the story of Israel as well. Those who are fighting discrimination need to know that we have a story of discrimination also. Second, connect to Israel. Before the pandemic, we tried to rally a trip. I'm sort of glad we didn't go because we would have gone right in the middle of all of the sickness. But we do need to go. And when the time is right, we as a congregation will line up and go again. But above and beyond, we need to support our college students. Have any college students in the room? You all are the ones fighting on the front lines. You are fighting on our behalf. We are able to shut off the people we disagree with. We unlike them on Facebook. We put down the phone. We change the channel. But anti-Semitism is rife, and anti-Zionism is rife on college campuses. In a Brandeis research paper, Anti-Semitism in the College Campus, Perception and Realities, Leonard Sachs, Theodore Sasson, and Graham Wright, and Shachar Hecht Wright. More than 1/4 of undergraduate respondents describe hostility towards Israel on campus by their peers as a fairly or very big problem, and nearly 15% perceive the same level of hostility towards Jews. Nearly 1/4 of respondents report to having been blamed during the past year for the actions of Israel because they were Jewish. About 1/3 of college undergraduate respondents report having been verbally harassed during the past year because they were Jewish, and nearly 3/4 of respondents report having been exposed at one time during the past year to at least one of 6 anti-Semitic statements. Despite a significant number perceiving their campus environment to be hostile to Israel and Jews, students report high level of connection to Israel. These levels of connection are higher than those found among similar individuals even in 2014, before the Israel-Hamas conflict. Connection to Israel is the strongest predictor of perceiving a hostile environment towards Israel and Jews on campus, and to a lesser extent of personal experiences of anti-Semitic and verbal harassment. So what do we do to support these students? First and foremost, we listen to them when they tell their stories. And second of all, I'm not going to ask, but I am pretty sure that each and every one of you have gotten a piece of mail from your alma mater, probably more than once, saying, "Would you like to give us money?" My friends, if they want us to be loyal alumni, they need to support us as well. We need to be in touch with our alma maters and tell them anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campuses is not acceptable to us. We can criticize Israel, but there is a difference between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and legitimate criticism of Israel. And we are absolutely the arbiters of what that is. If we have voice, if we have power, and if we have an ahavat Yisrael, a love of the people and the land of Israel, that we have an obligation to speak up. Israel is like an old friend. Yes, over the years they have made a lot of mistakes, and yes, they are still our friend. Yes, we tell them when they're messing up. No, we don't tell them they shouldn't exist anymore. These are my opinions, and I hope that I have substantiated them for you. And I hope that if you disagree, that rather than saying, "Feh," that you will come talk to me after Yom Kippur. But more than that, I hope you will support our co-religionists. I hope you will support Israel. I hope you will remember that Israel is not what creates hate, but it is hatred that was one of the creators of Israel. Shana Tova.